welcome. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to be here myself and talk about the CWE program. Our agenda today, really, as the title suggests, is we're going to talk through sort of the current state of the CWE program, which many of you may know a little bit about or maybe a lot about. And then we're going to talk about not only where we are, but sort of our plan forward going ahead and some of our strategic focus areas in the coming year and time ahead. So kicking things off, CWE's been around since 2007 or so, but really where I want to start the talk today for the purposes of focusing our discussion is around 2019 when we made the decision, the CWE program made the decision to federate. And really that meant that we could facilitate successful outcomes with relation to our program missions and goals, really. And these are around faster content development, minimizing sort of the technical debt that can build up over time due to the fact that, the development of content might be slow if it was more in a centralized model. It also means that we can expand the expertise throughout the ecosystem, right? Program partners certainly bring their own expertise and experience in certain domains or contexts that can be the benefit of all for this community developed program of information. And there's really a less separation level between the users and the program operators. And so in looking at what it looks like now as far as how we're defining these mission goals and desired outcome, this is really the breakdown, right? What the program does, what is CWE? It is a community developed list of known weakness types in software and hardware. And our mission really is to identify and define those weaknesses. The goals that we have pertain to its coverage. That is to say, how much weakness knowledge is out there? What are we covering? What do we not cover that we should? What are our gaps? And then also the adoption. We want to the information that is provided in CWE, which can bring tremendous value to understanding the root causes of vulnerabilities that may appear in products, that may appear early on in the development and the system development lifecycle, software development lifecycle, understanding the weaknesses that can be manifest as vulnerabilities later on in the process. These are the kinds of valuable information such that when we have more people using it and contributing to it, it's for the better of all, and organizations can reap the benefits of that as well. And ultimately, the desired outcome is that, yes, we have more secure software, hardware, and operational technology at the time of deployment and ongoing maintenance. So what does the program really look like at the end of the day? This is a visual that sort of describes that. The way federation works in a CWE program context is that these groups in the middle, the CWE board, the hardware special interest group, the user experience working group, and so on, these groups gather regularly. They're open forums with the exception of the board. This is one that's nominated and there's a nomination process and a voting process. But program partners across the industry space, the academia, government labs, research facilities, our CISA vulnerability management program sponsor, as well as the HSETI team that really operates and maintains the program, of which I am a member, all come together in the context of these forums to discuss specific issues around what the subject, or the title, I should say, of each group suggests that it covers. And those things together are ultimately what make up the CWE program as it exists today. Some of the work that we do right now, you might be familiar with in the form of the Top 25. The Top 25 is one of our most well-known outputs from the program, which is the full title, The Most Dangerous Software Weaknesses. It's something that we publish annually that is informed by data within the National Vulnerability Database with respect to the root causes of vulnerabilities that are most prevalent and severe over the previous 2 years. Just this last year, we actually expanded upon that in a rollout of additional information of trend analysis that focused on weaknesses that sort of just missed the cusp of the top 25. So looking at the next 15, we also looked at trends over the last 5 years of doing that methodology of what we've seen, what we've learned, what has moved, what has not moved. To that end, we published as well a stubborn weaknesses in the top 25, which are actually 15 CWEs that have appeared in every single list, as well as potential mitigations for those kinds of weaknesses. And then lastly, just around the end of the year, I want to say, we published an analysis of the most common and severe weaknesses present in the KEV, so CIS's known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. So as the current state of the program, as I mentioned, we have the working groups focusing in different areas, and we also do trend analysis like this that brings value and understanding of what's going on in the real world. In addition to that, we also do other trend analysis focusing on what are we seeing outside of the top 25 in terms of types of weaknesses that are problematic. There's been publications from industry focused on different groupings, different classes of weaknesses. And there was suggestion around the prevalence of memory safety. And we did an analysis from that, looking at the data that we used in our top 25, again, coming from NVD. And we wanted to understand, okay, within the data that we see, memory safety is a critical issue, and we find that that is definitely true. And if you were to break down the 938 weaknesses within CWE, where would the weaknesses fall into different buckets if it wasn't memory safety? And what do those things look like? And so we did an analysis on that ultimately included 22 different groupings of weaknesses. And what we saw was that memory safety is absolutely a severe concern and something that is very prevalent throughout publicly disclosed vulnerabilities, but also that other issues like injection are also severe. And interestingly, this is something that's important to track over time, where even if something was to change and suddenly injection or memory safety wasn't a number one or a number two in the data that we saw, something else would be. And where should we focus our efforts therein? One of the other things that we've been doing recently in our current state of the program is addressing the usability of the program. For many years, we have received feedback about the sort of challenge around onboarding to using CWE information and understanding how not only to just understand CWE information, but to use it for different contexts. And through one of the groups that I mentioned just a few slides ago, the User Experience Working Group has really focused on that over the last couple of years through a couple of ways. And we're sort of taking these initial steps before continuing on this road of improving usability throughout the corpus. And I'm going to talk about that in the road ahead as well. But for right now, I want to talk about specifically the filtering of weaknesses and also improving root cause mapping support throughout the corpus. So firstly, regarding weakness filtering, this is something that is very helpful for those that have specific needs around the information that they want from a CWE. If you go to any entry in CWE, chances are you will be greeted with a very large wall of text. This is something we are aware of and we want to try and address in very useful ways. And this was one that came out of the User Experience Working Group, our partnering with industry and academia and other members in that, which is to say, okay, can we take that entire entry and sort of provide default values that sort of cuts through a lot of the other information and presents just certain kinds of information that might be valuable for particular use cases. And you can see those 5 buttons there underneath the title of CWE 125 that give you the conceptual information, the sort of description, the high-level elements of a weakness such that you can understand it from a conceptual point of view, operational, which is more on the technical side and provides demonstrative examples of that weakness in code, for example. Mapping friendly, as you can imagine, is related, cutting away a lot of the extra detail and focusing specifically on where this weakness is actually represented in things like the OWASP top 10, for example, or in other taxonomies, or rather for doing things like root cause mapping, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And cutting to the chase, you can see also there's a customizable feature, which can say you can choose specifically the kinds of information that you want that isn't part of the default setting and go through the site accordingly. It will stay that way as you navigate throughout the corpus. Before I talk about our current state with respect to root cause mapping support, I wanted to do a quick sidebar on the CWE hierarchy. So CWE is broken down according to a hierarchy from abstract, very abstract conceptual weaknesses to more specific variants. And sort of as you can see here, moving from top down from high abstraction, there's the most abstract type of weakness called a pillar. And from there, there are child and parent relationships going down to more abstract levels. So I've got an example here starting with CWE 284, improper access control, a very broad level weakness, as we refer to as a pillar. And then going down from there, you'll see that there is more specificity as you go down the tree, so to speak. There are certain terms around improper in CWE, I should say in a CWE context, that can cover both missing or incorrect things, right? So when you talk about improper access control, you might have a point that is saying missing access control, right? You'll have examples of that. You'll also have examples of missing access control. Now, as you get down further on in the tree, you have child's relationships of base level weaknesses and variant level weaknesses. And this is all sort of defined under the amount of information within the entry, defining a weakness based on its number of its weakness elements. And I've put those here, which are really 5 things. From the pillar on down to the first, pillar in class, you'll have an example of maybe one or two weakness dimensions within that sort of broad abstract level of a weakness. As you move down to a base and variant, you will see that you will have more elements of or rather I should say weakness dimensions defined to add that increased specificity and low level of abstraction to the weakness definition. And so what we encourage in root cause mapping, and this is why I wanted to dive through sort of a brief segue on the hierarchy of CWE, is that really when it comes to root cause mapping, you want to have actionable information. If I'm using CWE to understand the root cause, I want to know not just broadly what is the very abstract idea around access control associated, that is responsible for a particular CVE record. I want to know an actionable information around more of the information. I realize this doesn't have a laser pointer, I don't think, to include resource, what language, what technology is it relevant to, right? And that's where we get to the root cause mapping labels, which as you can see, while all of these classes, or rather all of these abstractions of weaknesses, I should say are weaknesses, not all of them should be mapped to. And that's where we get into the definition of the labeling. So when we think about a category of weaknesses in CWE, because within CWE, in addition to broad abstract weakness types, you can also have categories which group CWEs according to a particular domain or context. And those are not weaknesses. So under any circumstances, really, when it comes to the idea of root cause analysis of a vulnerability, you would never want to point to a category, simply because that category contains weaknesses. It's not a weakness in and of itself. So that's where we have sort of the language there at the top saying prohibited. With the purpose of CWE 20 as an example of a class level weakness, which is still in many cases very abstract, and in that case, just the child of a pillar. So still very abstract weakness. This is discouraged, right? Because you can go further down the tree for actionability. And as you can see, as you go down, we get to the actionable space. This is where we understand, okay, there's more specific information that can tell me what are the ways that I can mitigate this in a really appropriate context. What is the kind of information I can find, for example, that might have a demonstrative example of the text, rather I should say of the code, so I can see this weakness in particular code that demonstrates not only the bad code that shows it, but also the good code that improves the problem. One of the things that you can see here, and I'll just point to it really quick, right next to where you've got the title of an entry and you've got the weakness identifier number and you've got vulnerability mapping, that link there. Anytime you click on that throughout the corpus now, you will be able to snap very quickly down to the vulnerability mapping notes associated with that weakness. And hopefully you can see it here. I know it's very small, so I apologize for that. But really what the mapping notes give, it's a new thing in the CWE schema as of around mid last year, which contains additional supporting information around mapping to that particular CWE. So some of the things around why something might be discouraged, for example, not necessarily saying don't ever do this, but why it's discouraged. And this is one that very often is used in a way that's really not helpful, which is mapping to CWE 20 in many instances, which is the improper input validation example I gave. And you can see in the vulnerability mapping notes, it says why. And that's because it's frequently misused when it comes to low information vulnerability reports, which is to say a description is provided, a reference is very uncertain, it's unclear, there's not enough information. And so very often someone will say who's doing root cause mapping, well, this is improper input validation and call it a day. But there's actually a lot of children under CWE 20 that could be used to provide more information and to better understand the actual root cause underneath the vulnerability in question. And they're listed here. So I don't have to read them out in terms of the numbers, but specified quantity, specified index position or offset, things like specified type, all these kinds of things that are more specific about the kind of input validation problem. So again, the key takeaway here is that as of the schema CWE 7.0, every entry within CWE now has mapping notes that can be quickly linked to underneath the title, in addition to that sort of label that says approved or discouraged and why. So moving on, in addition, before I talk about the roadhead, I also wanted to talk about the current state around the metrics associated with the CWE program, which is something that we're trying to do more of and trying to improve upon each year. So one of the things that we know is that CWE is being used throughout the vulnerability management ecosystem. According to the MVD CVMAP program, which was a program to identify when CNAs were providing weakness information associated with their CVE records, 276 of the CNAs at the time this was pulled, which was just a couple weeks ago, are providing CWE information. What we also know is that the accuracy of that information is not where we'd want it to be. And that's why you may have been around yesterday when there was the panel discussion around the root cause mapping working group and the initiative therein. I'll talk a little bit about that in this talk as well. But what we know about this is actually coming from our top 25 initiative. Every year when we do this, we collect all the data associated with CVE records over the previous 2 calendar years. We run a series of automated scans to identify where there's problematic mappings, very often, let's say, focusing in very high-level classes, or where there is a suggestion that a mapping is incorrect based on the content of the CVE description and the mapping provided. In short, in the previous calendar year, I should say the 2023 top 25, that total data set was roughly 44,000 CVE records, of which our manual analysis, again informed by our automated scraping of the information, looked at about 7,000, not about, exactly 7,466 CVE records, which we said, let's look at these a little bit closer so we can make sure the top 25 is as accurate as possible. And what we found was, in fact, 5,347 of those did need to be remapped to something more accurate. So, high-level point, we know the community is interested and willing to do this, and there's some way to go to make doing this more accurate and precise. What we've also been doing, as I mentioned at the very top of the talk, is federating the program. And federating the program comes in the form of setting up working groups to work, bringing on additional partners to the program to provide support and to provide expertise. And this is I understand this is probably a hard thing to track in terms of what we're seeing on the numbers here. But with respect to federating, is that what we're seeing is that increasing community participation is increasing our program coverage. Over the previous 5 years since we've implemented this strategy, we have expanded the scope of CWE to include hardware. For the first time in 2019 through collaboration amongst the hardware CWE SIG members. In addition to that, you'll also notice there's a big sort of gap on the left column there, which says submissions received. In 2022 is when we set up the submission server for incorporating more direct and more, I should say, more facilitating better engagement with our partners for providing CWE information. And I'm really excited to say a little later on, focusing on how we're going to facilitate collaboration on CWE content development in a new capability as well. But the key takeaway here is we are being very intentional about leveraging the community expertise that joins with the program in these various working groups to grow the coverage of the program. And there's more there on that. One of the other things, as I mentioned, in terms of usability that we've focused thus far at our current state is some of the things around the CWE webpage with respect to root cause mapping, with respect to some of the filtering capabilities and other such things there. And there's really a lot more to come. What we do know at the top level is that community partners are interested in collaborating to expand our program and adoption, which is a great thing. We enjoy really wonderful collaboration with our community program partners. And while we have made modest enhancements to the website and its information, we're really at the start of this. Really, where we are right now is going to be the path forward turning point in trying to address fundamental challenges around usability and navigability of the corpus, which I'm going to talk about in the road ahead section. So when we think about CWE going forward, we're really going to continue on this path of federation. We know that this is working both from a program coverage perspective. We know this is working from a program adoption perspective. We're going to really focus going forward on usability. And I'm going to talk about usability at both the macro and micro level. And by that, I mean the sort of high level, broad scope of the entire CWE corpus and navigating and groupings of CWEs and other such things, and micro level, which is within a CWE itself. How can we improve understanding? How can we remove redundant language? How can we make sure that the information is understandable and concise? And then lastly, we're going to be talking about going forward, really focusing on the CWE program and CWE information as a vehicle for some of the things that are really valuable to the vulnerability management ecosystem, to include the benefits of root cause mapping. Being able to do root cause analysis facilitates a lot of really great value to both organizations and the landscape perspective. And also the idea of secure by design. CWE really provides the information for organizations as they are designing and developing products to avoid known problems and flaws and mistakes that ultimately can become vulnerabilities that we are dealing with all the time, every day. So growing the program federation with respect to coverage. As I mentioned, we're going to continue on with our working groups and SIGs as we are. There's wonderful work there. But I want to call attention to the CWE content development repository today, which is something that is opening up and providing a platform for collaboration amongst our partners to develop CWE content in a new way. And that is, it will also provide transparency into the working queue, the sort of status of CWEs that are in development. This can include new CWEs entirely, whole sets of new CWE coverage if we're moving into a new domain that we don't cover, but also modifications, new examples of weaknesses maybe that are relevant to a new context, let's say in the AI space, where an existing weakness in software or hardware is relevant in the AI space, and we need to make sure that that weakness covers that appropriately in terms of the schema, in the description, perhaps an example instance. We have been conducting a pilot, actually a series of pilots on the CDR, we call it, that includes those that have already submitted content to us. This is a GitHub repository where you provide your GitHub username, and you are able to have your submission come from both our submission form, ingested into the CDR, and work with the community in there to move it along the process to make a public and published CWE on our website. The pilot phase is nearing completion. The second phase of the pilot, I should say, we've been testing engagement amongst and the different levels of communication that needs to occur between the CWE team, as well as the different partners around that are contributing and sort of navigating all the mishmash, as you can imagine, of communications within that. But the wide launch is definitely around the corner in spring. And what I can say today is, if you are interested in the CDR, both to just see what is in there right now or to provide input, or perhaps you have a CWE that you in your mind that needs to be added to the corpus, please do reach out, CWE@mitre.org. I know it's not on there. It'll be there at the end, I promise. But you can ask for access and you can gain access to it. Right now, we're understanding just sort of as we scale, welcoming in more and more people to contribute and see that. As well as the adoption side, we're going to be really focusing on usability, and that's where I'm going to be talking about over the next couple of minutes here. So I mentioned the macro perspective. CWE has usability problems. We know this. And this includes the macro perspective, which is saying, when you go to the CWE website, perhaps you have a particular need focusing on weaknesses related to a particular context. Perhaps you have a particular need that you aren't quite sure about, but you want to be able to navigate to a certain kind of CWE information related to a particular context. So that's what the macro perspective really is. It's understanding how, as a whole, within the CWE website, we can better organize CWEs. We can better define them sort of at a structural level and across the website. Right now, we have things like categories, as I mentioned. We have views, which are sort of provided for these single purposes. But we want to be able to simplify access, and not only simplify access, but improve the associative navigation between one view or one context of CWE to different parts of the website. And right now, there's a tremendous amount of difficulty in doing that if you don't really know where you're going, and we recognize that. So part of our usability improvements in usability are going to focus at the macro level. Last point is the completeness, and this is something that we're looking forward to, and we already have seen success amongst the CDR participants, is identifying where CWEs need more information related to them. I'll give you an example. On the hardware CWE corpus, which we now have about 100, maybe 104, something like that, weaknesses related to hardware in CWE, many of them did not have information around detection methods, right? Which is a part of the schema associated with, okay, well, how do I find this weakness in our product? And this is something that the hardware CWE SIG has been contributing recently through the CDR and also just through engagement in the meetings, discussing some of those that need to be completed. And so when we think about the macro usability of CWE, we want to make sure that all entries are properly populated with the information that is out there. So in contrast, the micro perspective of CWE, and this is something that I think at the end of the day is going to be a bigger challenge because, as I mentioned, CWE as it stands is 938 weakness types. There's going to be more weakness types. We don't know all the weakness types as it is right now. It's not done. So as it grows, we want to incorporate those things, but we also want to alleviate the challenge around understandability and usability within CWE to the point where when people are first going to an entry, one of the things is it is requiring a considerable amount of mental cycles sometimes to understand the difference between one weakness and another weakness. And why is that? We have a problem around redundancy of information in many cases. When it comes to a description, what is the unique amount of information that's needed in a CWE description? What you'll find, and actually I have an example to walk through this, so I won't talk necessarily right now about it till I get to, but you'll notice that there's language within, perhaps you will find an example of where there's an example instance of a weakness within its description, right? Well, we have a schema element for example instances, and that's where that information should be. You might see an impact, potential impact associated with the exploitation of a weakness within the description, or you might see it within an example instance. That should be in the common consequences element of a CWE. With this in mind, I know this is sort of getting in the weeds. The idea is simply that we can reduce the wall of text associated with CWEs, make the usability simpler, such that people can understand more easily and then navigate to the additional information appropriately on the site where it should be. Lastly, the idea of visualizations. CWE for a very, very long time has always been text, just as it has always focused on software until 2019. When hardware was incorporated into the corpus, there was the point that was saying, well, we're talking about system on chips with these weaknesses. Sometimes it's not necessarily always Verilog code. Sometimes it's not always that kind of language that you can demonstrate in that. So we need a capability to do that. And we have a sort of nascent capability to do that, but that was the turning point catalyst for that in the hardware CWE content. And so how can we incorporate visualizations perhaps throughout the corpus for other weaknesses that don't have graphics that might be more informative and a different way to learn about different weaknesses through. So I want to give an example. And this is a perfect example because I was just seeing that CISA put out a guidance today with respect to SQL injection. So check that out. CWE 89, improper neutralization of special elements used in a SQL command. Now, that is a complex title, but really what it is it's describing the actual mistake that is made for a SQL injection to be possible. The actual act of injection itself is an attack, right? But it is improper, that is, again, missing or incorrect neutralization of the elements in a SQL command such that you're sort of mixing up the data and code. However, the point is not to read all this, but you can see what it looks like from the context page when you go for CWE 89 and you're looking at the complete visual of what that wall of text looks like describing. You'll notice it has a description, an extended description. It then goes into relationships. What you can't see here, I'd have to have probably 4, 5, 6 slides. It would have common consequences, potential mitigations, example instances, demonstrative examples, observed examples, references. There would be a lot of information. All of which is very valuable for different contexts, but it does contribute to usability problems. This is a draft demo of what we've been talking about in the user experience working group for how perhaps a micro level improvement throughout the corpus could look. It is to say, let's simplify the descriptions. Let's remove an extended description because very often it might not actually be helping so much as rewording, which can be valuable, but perhaps starting to talk about things that are covered in different parts of the entry itself. And so when I talk about redundant information, talking about an example instance or a potential outcome or an impact that's in the description, I've now removed that language. I realize you can't read it, but for example, if it's talking about bypassing access to a database, that's now removed and it's put down in the common consequences down there, right? Throughout the corpus or throughout the entry, you can pull information that was actually in this bit here, those 3 paragraphs, and start to shrink it down so it's more readable, it's more understandable, but the information isn't gone, it's just better presented. And that's what we're looking about, improving CWE usability on a micro level perspective. The challenge here again is that we have 938 weaknesses that we need to do this to. So just a quick sort of refresher for those that were at the root cause mapping panel discussion yesterday. One of the things, the primary use cases that brings real value from CWE information is root cause mapping. And really, the idea around the root cause mapping working group that was discussed yesterday is federating accurate and precise root cause mapping throughout the ecosystem. The graphic here is nothing new probably to this audience, but we understand and we know through time and history and repetition and mistakes made that vulnerabilities, as they are discovered later in the life cycle, are more expensive and more difficult to deal with. But what we also know is that they're caused by weaknesses. And the weaknesses very often are implemented much earlier on in the life cycle. So as you can see, I've sort of got 2 examples here, one in the design stage, one in the development stage, but maybe they're not discovered until very late in the deployment or maintenance stage, and we're talking about vulnerability management, why we're all here. But doing this not only helps avoid these kinds of things, root cause mapping is valuable for a lot of reasons. You can drive the removal of whole classes of vulnerabilities if you know the repeated vulnerability mistakes that are being made in your products. It can provide that essential information loop back to your software development lifecycle. And organizations do this. We know this. We've talked to them, and they're part of the root cause mapping working group. Knowing the mistake that is made and filtering that information back in a continuous manner through the SDLC or the architecture design planning means that you can avoid making the same mistakes going forward. It also illuminates, based on the trend analysis that you can do with accurate root cause mapping, where investments and policy and practices and training and all sorts of things can address the kinds of weaknesses that are being manifest as vulnerabilities in your products. And that's something that can be done both at an organizational level as well as sort of a landscape perspective across understanding, as I mentioned before, when we're looking at groupings of weakness types related to memory safety, right? What can we do about that? Well, groupings related to resource lifecycle management. What can we do with that information? So there's really a multifaceted problem. And again, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but there's sort of the data problem itself within CVE information. Historically speaking, I think it's fair to say that the downstream consumers of CVE information never really cared about the root cause, right? They cared about the impact. They cared about the relevance to their products or their operations. They cared about if there is a patch, how severe is it? What does this mean for me? Do I need to care at all? And not root cause mapping. But also, in addition to that, we have a problem around the data of it's not always provided. It's hard. It's expensive in time and resources to identify root cause mapping. Often there's also a different kind of skill set, understanding the difference between a weakness and a vulnerability. Sometimes they're used interchangeably. And then lastly, sometimes there's a case of saying, well, I don't know if I really want to be public about this, right? I know it's a vulnerability. I've taken care of it. No problem. I've done my CVE record. It's in there, but I don't really want to be public about what the actual root cause of it was. In addition to that, we have multifaceted problem. We have CWE complexity, right? As I mentioned, the CWE corpus is very difficult to use, and we know that, and we're trying to address it. But as it stands, navigating it, finding the appropriate CWE, we've heard even today the challenge around that, right? There's arguments. Well, no, it's this, it's this. It's actually these two things. There's a chain of things. This is hard. We have to address that. In addition to that, there's really no existing capabilities right now that facilitate this in an easy way to say, okay, I know this information about this vulnerability, and I can, through maybe a decision-making tool or some sort of chatbot technology, do this accurately, consistently throughout the ecosystem. So we do know also, as I mentioned, centralized root cause mapping is really expensive and it's difficult to scale. This was the primary argument around our federation concept yesterday in the root cause mapping panel. But really, there's a solution to this. We think that root cause mapping can be improved building on the success and the federation of the CVE and the CWE program. And if we can bring together the CVE and the CWE program stakeholders together, that is to say, we can encourage and have further adoption of doing this. In addition, we have the capability within current capabilities of the CVE program around the new JSON 5.0 format that really facilitates this. It makes it very easy for CNAs who are really the best positioned to provide this information in their CVE records. That means we don't need to have the CWE top 25 team say, well, I'm going to look at this and say, it's not that weakness. We need to look at it and change it again. That's slow. And it doesn't, that's a loser long term. In addition, as I mentioned, we have very concrete plans around improving the CWE usability at the macro and the micro level, as I talked about. And lastly, within the root cause mapping working group, going forward, we're going to be talking about community-driven solutions to help simplify this process. We've done some initial studying and testing, as I mentioned, with chatbot technology around, inputs for vulnerability language, maybe taking a reference, taking, those kinds of things, throw it at a machine, see what happens. We've seen mixed results thus far, but this is improving rapidly. And how can we leverage those developments to facilitate easier mapping? So yeah, if you got a sticker, I hope you put it on your laptop or something like that. Everybody will see it. They're out there. This is also a call to action. This is a new working group that we're really hoping that members of the CNA community join us. We're going to be meeting regularly. It's an open partnership between members of the CVE program and the CWE program. It's really meant to be at the nexus of those two programs. And we want to collaborate with you. We want to hear from you about your challenges in doing root cause mapping, some of the issues that you face in using CWE, and get together to work on community-driven solutions. This is an example of what I was talking about with respect to a capability. So thinking about a capability for accurate and efficient weakness identification and mapping is really something that's sorely needed to improve and move the needle here, which is that we could have someone who is an analyst at a within a PCERT, and they're writing a vulnerability description. They provide details, they provide information, maybe they provide code if it's an open source one. And they churn out and they get an output perhaps that gives them 4 or 5 weaknesses from the CWE corpus to consider. That is markedly better than what we would have right now. And that is possible right now. I would say that our initial testing on it hasn't been, it's not there yet, but it's getting better and better. The other alternative that we've thought about with respect to a sort of decision-making tool here is on the right. It's very hard to see, but for those of you that are aware of the attack framework, there's this tool called Decider where you can sort of click through what is the adversary trying to do. Okay, they're doing that, and then they're doing that, and eventually you get down to a tactic or technique within the attack framework for that, and something could be done according to the CWE schema as well. So that's something we're thinking about. The last bullet there too, I wanted to really foot stomp, which is the idea of improved root cause mapping guidance. We did just publish this last Friday, sort of secretly, but it is on the website. If you go to cwe.mitre.org, front and center, you'll see our old friend, the dinosaur sticker guy, and it will also point you to the most recent guidance that we've updated. Previously, we had guidance going back from 2021 from partners that we worked with to develop, and now we have new guidance that's come directly from root cause mapping working group members as well. And we hope that that's really valuable. I encourage people to use it and check it out. And please reach out and let us know if there's something else that would be valuable. In addition to just guidance, there is actually examples. So there are CVE examples in there that you can see the information within the CVE description, the decision-making around the language within there, and how to understand and identify what the root cause is in the language, which I think is really valuable, and I hope you will too. So check it out. So just wrapping this up, as far as our ongoing evolution of the program, it's really coming down to 3 things. We want to have effective community engagement in the CWE program. We want to recruit and encourage participation from expertise throughout the vulnerability management ecosystem, throughout the product development ecosystem, such that we can leverage their expertise to improve the coverage of the program. We also want to have a strong corpus of information. We want to expand to new areas of coverage accordingly. There's a lot of discussion around AI and the relevance for the CWE program, and that's something that we're talking about in our working groups, understanding that, well, what is the unique element of AI? There's going to be software relevant weaknesses that perhaps we do cover, and we need to provide information in maybe a more tailored way. There's hardware relevance in AI, and perhaps we need to provide coverage in a more tailored way. However, there's probably gaps in terms of coverage of the program overall in terms of weaknesses in an AI context, and that's something that we want to work with the community on. And lastly, really hammering home today, the positive user experience. We have heard feedback from the community, both in our working groups and in sessions like this and other engagements, that the CWE user experience needs to improve. Talked about some of the ways that we're going to focus on doing that at a macro and micro perspective going forward. And that's really going to be a focus of our time in the coming months and the rest of the year for sure. Yeah, and I can open it up for questions. There's the information. Sorry, just as a final thing. I will say this is a community-driven program, and we'd love to have you as a partner. So please reach out if you're interested in any of the working groups or SIGs that I mentioned before. CWE@mitre.org is the easiest, but Summers@mitre.org is going directly to me.
Hey, you done?
Go to him first.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's one up here too. Yeah.
Hey, Bob Lord says a great presentation.
Hi, Bob.
Thank you so much for doing this. Super clear. I'm going to have to up my game in terms of presentation style. So thank you very much. Also, the CWE program is one of the critical foundational building blocks for secure by design. Like we can't really get better at making software safer until we know what is currently the state of affairs. So super interested in this. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the decision to federate the assignment, if I understood it correctly, the assignment of the CWEs, rather than to hold the software companies accountable for the mistakes that they're making, for the coding errors that they're introducing. So why would we not say, you should do this? And if the answer is because they haven't listened to us, can we reopen that conversation?
So if I understand the question, I'm understanding it to say, why are we emphasizing federation of program coverage, CWE coverage, versus holding the software makers or the product makers accountable for the weaknesses in their software? To have them do, well, okay, so maybe we're talking about the same thing, because I'm going to try and answer it in the way that I think you're asking. The idea of federating program coverage through the CDR is a capability that's meant to have not us providing the information about the weaknesses or to improve the weaknesses. That's slow. That's a loser. We need to leverage, just like across the expansion into hardware, we did not use the CWE's team's expertise to drive the scope expansion, or rather the coverage of the program expansion into hardware. We leveraged partnerships with Intel and NVIDIA and countless others. There's 100, organizations or representatives, dozens of organizations representing the hardware SIG. And most recently, really excitedly, there was the four most recent published weaknesses related to transient execution, which was written in a collaboration amongst Intel, AMD, RiskCure, ARM. That's right. Thank you. Which was really exciting. So Bob, to your question, I would say that the purpose entirely within the CDR is to leverage the community expertise to provide that information. With respect to holding them accountable, the program itself is not necessarily responsible for tracking, I think, the idea of holding organizations responsible for doing them so much as tracking through the form of root cause mapping, for example, right? We have the data, perhaps, if that is accomplished through the accurate federation of root cause mapping throughout, let's say, the CNA community, then we can say to those individual organizations, hey, we're seeing these weaknesses in your products. But with respect to the CDR and content development, that's really focused on federating the expertise, knowing that we do not have all the expertise when it comes to weaknesses in various technologies.
Hi. When you publish the top 25, top 10, things like that, how do you take into account the fact that it's a mix of abstraction classifications?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do we take into account? So we do take it into account in this way. The data problem as it exists is such that if we were to fully just yoink the data down from MVD and not do any of the mapping analysis on it fundamentally, what we often see is there's a tremendous amount of mappings within a certain tree of information. So there's a lot of information that's mapping to something like, initially there was categories, and we thankfully have sort of encouraged that not being the case anymore.
When you say category, you mean the pillars?
No, I literally mean categories. There are entries within CWE that are just collections of weaknesses called a category, and people were mapping to those. So they're not weaknesses. But yes, for another example would be mapping to something very broad, very abstract, I should say, a pillar or a class. And how we account for that is trying, as I mentioned, when we do our automated scanning across the entire data set to see what we can manually manage to review, right, with the amount of time that we have. We identify, here's all these weaknesses that are mapping to CWE 20, right? This was before we had guidance around each entry saying, please don't use this or look at these other ones. So if people were doing that, we would go in and say, okay, let's look at the reference. Let's look at the bug report. Let's do that as much as we can. I think I mentioned we did that for about 7,500 CVEs last time. Let's try and get down the tree further, right? Now, what you'll see in the top 25 is it's not immediately eliminated, right? You'll see that there's a number of weaknesses that are very closely related. In fact, there's some relationships that are direct within the top 25 to say, oh, this is a child of this one, but they're both in there, right? And that is something that we have to improve. And the way that we're going to do that, we hope, is to encourage people to do more accurate and precise mapping at the time of disclosure. rather than a centralized approach where someone is using whatever information is provided to try and do it.
Okay. Is there that makes sense? Thank you very much. Is there a list that would map up to the highest parent?
Is there a list that would map? Sorry, can you say again?
So like, I mean, like, use, like, let's say there's a list that just shows the base, that just shows the class level or something like that,
Mhm.
right? Because of the variance and the fact that there can be multiple children of the same and the class,
Yep.
all in the same hierarchy in the
Yep.
list.
So you're saying could we generate a list that does that?
Is it useful? Is that useful?
It may be. We could certainly toy with that. I mean, there's different use cases for how people use the top 25. I mean, it's a prioritization tool, right?
Right.
So I would say that's certainly possible potentially for different users, and we could look into that. I mean, I'd be curious what it would look like ultimately between the difference between the tool. As I mentioned, if we were to do none of the scraping to try and get more precise mappings, there's much more of that at the top, right?
Okay. Yeah, based off, I just one more piece of feedback, and then I'll let the microphone go. But based off of all I'm hearing about EPSS, that I'd like to see some type of mapping to EPSS at some point in time. That'd be cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I want to eliminate my personal bias. Can you tell me how I should interpret the statement that 71% had to be or were recommended to be rewritten?
Sure. So what that was we took the entire data set. So first off, let me just repeat. The question is about what was it? 7,000
Yeah, so
that needed to be corrected.
right,
So
so
say
two-part
7,000.
two-part question, like made the statement 71% were need to be rewritten. How should I interpret that as a cyber professional?
Right. Okay. So let me just clarify because I want to make sure that it's not miscommunicated. The top 25 consists of CVE records across the previous 2 calendar years. So it included a grand total of CVE records of about 45,000. We cannot manually verify those. We do know based on previous years that there is data quality problems saying that we need to try and identify, or rather there are certain mappings that we need to improve. We've developed scraper tools that sort of go through that whole data set and identify the lowest hanging fruit that we say, okay, these, to be clear, are probably problematic, right? These scrapers are not perfect. They're sort of like the absolute lowest of hanging fruit. That was about 7,500 out of the 45,000 or whatever it is, which our HS SETI, the MITRE team, the CWE team, works through, and we go through all the information associated with those 7,500 records. And then we identify what we think is the correct mapping, right? As opposed to what was mapped to. So in the data that you're asking about, basically the 7,500 needed to be corrected for accurate and more precise CWE mappings to then be put back into the MVD data, which we work with the MVD to do. Now, how are you to interpret that? What I would say is I'll say my own personal perception, we don't do a good enough job of helping those in the community understand the difference of what a vulnerability and a weakness is and the importance of it and making it easier to do it accurately. So that's part of it. And what I would also say is that what that means is that there is a missing understanding throughout the community too, and perhaps a reticence to provide, information in some regards.
So this then leads to the second part, which is as an operator or researcher, if you're telling me that 71% of it is wrong, it's not highly useful. If I'm a business investor and you tell me that you're using this information for where I should place my investments and 71% of them are wrong, it's not a good indicator of what a tool that I should be using for my investments. And so it kind of raises the question for me, if I'm understanding correctly, and I think you verified it when I asked you to clarify, we shouldn't be using it for this because there is an effort that needs to happen to make that go through and be validated. And what I don't know is that when can or when should I be trusting this data? Because right now I struggle, and probably to the point that you just made, of telling my junior security engineers that they should put a CW1 versus 2 and why,
Mhm.
because that's then driving business decisions. And I just don't feel like we're if I hear my management hears what you just described, they're going to raise some serious questions about why are we even bothering?
Yeah, so just to be clear around the 75%, what we're talking about is the 75% of the subset of what we know or what we had indications to believe were inaccurate. The true understanding of how inaccurate throughout the entire data cannot be manually reviewed. So we don't know exactly what the rate of that would be.
Understood. It's a sampling methodology.
Yeah.
Right. I'm with you. But
Yeah.
if I use that methodology, it still raises those questions. And I'm not sure what we should take back to our management chain because I don't know if we have confidence at this point or trust that we should bother.
Well, with respect to improving the data, because the data quality problem is definitely a thing. With respect to improving the data quality, I think there's a means to, sorry, I'm seeing a lot of hand signals. Oh, okay. The effort to improve this is fundamental to being able to do the things that are valuable around trend analysis. And right now, the data as it currently stands needs correction in many cases, not always. But this is something that we want to work through a federated environment to improve the ability of people to be able to do this better.
We do have one question from an online participant that we'd like to get to, and then that will take us to the end of our presentation time. The question from the participant is as follows. The list of orgs and companies for the interest groups and working groups seems very US-centric. Is there any initiative to expand more globally to get additional perspective?
The working groups and SIGs are open to the public. Anybody's welcome to join. So just wanted to be clear about that. The question from online, whoever, wherever you, please just reach out to the program and you should be able to be involved.